brought to you by Africa Muslims Agency. Africa Muslims Agency, a beacon of hope to communities for over 35 years in Africa and beyond. And with that being said, with South Africa facing economic challenges, mounting economic challenges, all eyes will be on Finance Minister Godongwana as he prepares to deliver the 2025 budget speech later today. Fiscal consolidation, rising debt, and the possibility of the dreaded tax increases have been key talking points in the lead up to this critical announcement. Experts have debated the balance between cutting spending and also increasing revenue and implementing much needed structural reforms to reignite economic growth. And to help us unpack what to expect from the minister's address, I'm joined by Thokozile Madonko. She's a researcher at the Public Economy Project at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University. Thokozile, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you giving us your time this morning.
Good morning, and good morning to your viewers.
I think first we can start with, the broad expectations. What are the key themes do you expect the Minister of Finance, Mr. Godongwana's budget speech to have later today?
So I think it's important to remember that there's the rhetoric and then the devil in the detail. And so I think the rhetoric, what he will say, will sound good. It will be encouraging. He's probably going to talk about fiscal consolidation, which is just a fancy word for austerity or cuts to government spending. He's going to talk about prioritizing infrastructure spending, particularly public-private partnerships and blended finance. So hoping that the private sector will come in on board and help drive the economic growth that they think this particular path will provide for us. But he's going to tell South Africans that we need to take a bit of pain in order to have a growth down the line. And that pain, unfortunately, is not felt equally. And so it's unlikely that we will see major changes to tax as debated. There's huge discussions. I'll be surprised if there's any changes. The pressures since October, since the medium-term budget policy statement, which is basically gives us a hint of what is going to come in February, there have been some major changes that have happened that need to be addressed. Importantly, we need to see what's going to happen with relating to our SOEs and continuing supporting our SOEs. And these are important entities. We need to support Eskom. We need to support Transnet. They play a crucial role in the structural drivers of growth in our economy. The other area is around NHI, which is hotly debated. It's a huge reform. It requires money to even think about the reform, let alone implement it. And so there's some questions about, is there going to be funding for that? And then the latest court action around the social relief of distress, which sees almost a 50% increase in uptake of the SRD grant if the appeal is not, sort of used to delay that. But if they do adhere to the court judgment and include the 13 odd million that qualify for this grant, then there needs to be money to make that available. And so those are the big ticket items that we have some questions about in terms of our research and work that is putting pressure on the budget.
I want to touch and expand a bit on, I think, a point that you touched on briefly, fiscal consolidation. The IMF has emphasized the need for more aggressive fiscal consolidation to curb South Africa's rising debt, now sitting at almost around 75% of GDP. Do you think the minister will take a tougher stance on this? And what impact could further fiscal consolidation have on public services, especially in crucial sectors like education, which we know there's been a lot of cuts on that front? You mentioned, healthcare with the reintroduction of, this new policy, and also just infrastructure development as a whole.
So, one researcher, author has said that austerity is a kind of madness. And fiscal consolidation, as I've said, is just a form of austerity, budget cuts. And it is a kind of madness because we've been implementing these cuts since 2012, and we haven't seen them deliver growth, improved services, reduction in our debt to GDP ratio. So it's globally, it has been recognized. And even the IMF has had to say that in the short term, fiscal consolidation hurts the economy. So it is not surprising that we will see lower growth if we continue with a fiscal consolidation pathway. And it's important to recognize that austerity has winners and losers. And the losers are the majority of South Africans who are dependent on public services. And we've seen that in this kind of cuts, so, core spending as a percentage of GDP, so what government spends on in terms of health, education, is now at the level it was in 2012. That's how far they've managed to cut it down. And in their plan, in the medium-term budget policy statement, Treasury said they were going to cut it by a further 2 percentage points, which means that they are reducing the size of the state and the capacity of the state to deliver services. So you should not be surprised when you walk down the road and you see potholes, or you see your local clinic, the wall paint is peeling, or your school hasn't had a janitor or any kind of maintenance, because all those budgets have been cut. And now we're seeing that creeping in, those cuts in terms of infrastructure. We're seeing it creeping in our experience of access to water, to electricity. These are all a result of fiscal consolidation and the cutting of these services. Expanded public works programs, municipal programs, so keeping our streets clean. These are all jobs that should be paid for. But in the sort of everyday economic speak, they're considered to be an expense, a cost. But it's completely crazy. We want people employed in this country. We have high unemployment, and we want them employed in areas that enable them to be productive in building, as the president said, an ethical and developmental state. So we want to be able to see people with good, decent jobs, providing clinical care, providing teaching, providing clean streets, and so forth. These are jobs, these that should be seen as an investment, not a cost. And unfortunately, in the kind of Washington consensus, the World Bank and IMF speak, these are considered a pressure on the fiscus and terrible for the economy. But what is really happening underneath that is saying, we want the private sector to take over the delivery of everything. So we want to commodify the provision of public goods, education, health, social welfare, and these things, and water, electricity, these are things that should not be subject to the market. They should be subject to what people can afford, and people who can afford them should pay for them. So we want a just system in which we have a state that is able to deliver services, and public goods in particular, that enables for economic growth and prosperity.
No, definitely. And I want to touch on, I think, a point that you've already touched on, but maybe just to expand a bit because of how important it is, especially for, majority of South Africans, that speculation about potential tax increases. How likely are they? And if so, which taxes might be affected? And secondly, there's been a debate about, tax hikes, being one of the key drivers to help stabilize public finances. But there's another side which claims, they risk slowing down economic growth even further. What's your take on this? Which side of the fence do you lean on regarding tax?
So it's important to go back to basics when we talk about tax. What is it that we want? Do we want roads that are functional? Do we want streetlights that work? Do we want teachers in schools? Do we want hospitals that function? If we do want these things, then we need to come together and support in the ways that we can through it's as old as time, death and taxes. Taxes play a role in enabling the state to be capable, to drive inclusive growth and job creation, all the wonderful things that the president spoke about in his SONA speech. So if we agree that taxation is a public good, then we need to make sure that we deliver taxes, revenue, which is often not spoken about. So I'm very pleased that you've raised it, is that revenue is a political decision. And it's also part of the social contract. It says, as living in South Africa, I recognize that nothing around me has come for free. I am not some magical individual living on an island and able to live independent of others And so when I drive on that road, when I employ somebody who's gone to university, when, all those kinds of aspects, you recognize that the public good has come into play, and the street lights and so forth, and water. So it's important for us to say that let's make sure that we have a tax structure that is just, fair, and redistributive. And we talk about progressive taxation as opposed to regressive. So regressive taxation is when, if you can't afford it and you're being forced to pay. Progressive is you pay according to your ability. And so what we've seen over time is that our tax structure has shifted away from corporate income tax. We've seen cuts to corporate income tax when we should have seen a stabilization, or even just allowing it to remain the same from the 1990s to enable us to have the revenue necessary through the booms and busts of the business cycle. But we also, so what has happened is we've shifted away from corporate income tax, and we've put the burden onto personal income tax. And that burden, unfortunately, is hitting the majority of the middle class, or the middle range of the tax structure. It doesn't hit the extremely wealthy. Extremely wealthy people pay very, very little tax because of tax avoidance, evasion, and all sorts of loopholes. And so we're seeing a situation where our tax structure is not progressive. It's potentially regressive, because we're not getting those high net worth individuals to pay their fair share of taxes. And so we talk about a wealth tax as being something that is doable. Globally, there's agreement that it needs to happen. It is not just to have 8 or 9 people globally owning the equivalent of half of the world's population. Super billionaires need to pay their fair share of tax. And so when I talk about paying tax and making sure that we pay a fair share of tax, I'm not talking about your middle class. I'm talking about your really wealthy, high net wealth individuals that could be contributing. And there's some fantastic research by the IEJ on this, and as well as my center, the Southern Center for Inequality Studies, that shows that a wealth tax is doable and would not harm. But we do need to have a global agreement, and there's some amazing opportunities through the G20 and globally where we're talking about a global tax agreement, so that you can't jump countries. And there's actually very little evidence that people will jump if you tax their wealth, because their wealth is usually assets, which is usually land, and so they're invested. So it's unlikely that they're going to suddenly up and leave. But there's this kind of threat that this is what they're going to do, if we tax them. But they're using the same roads as you and me, they are subject to the same electricity, water, so they should be paying their fair share. The other area that we could look at that is often not spoken about in terms of revenue generation is the structure of our debt. So we pay extremely high interest rates on our debt because we have a high risk premium. And so we need to look almost internally to say, what is our balance sheet as South Africa? What does it look like? What does our bank account look like? And where can we leverage strength in that balance sheet to be able to bring down the cost of our debt, because it's crowding out resources to social services. And so there are very innovative ways around. We saw with JFECRA, the golden, I can never remember the acronym, but the JFECRA account was used to leverage that. But we could use the Government Employment Pension Fund, the UIF. There is money sitting around that could be used to spur revenue that we need in order to build an infrastructure injection, so that we are building both, making sure that Eskom and Transnet and our water boards and everything can function and work and deliver the basics, but also that we invest in education and health and social development.
No, definitely. We're going to leave it here for now, Thokozile. Thank you so much for your insights. Thoroughly enjoyed the conversation and really appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you so much.
There you have it there. There was researcher at the Public Economy Project, Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University, Thokozile Madonko. And yeah, we'll certainly be keeping a close eye on Minister Godongwana's speech and the reactions that follow. And you can also catch it live. We'll be broadcasting it live from Cape Town, and you can watch it on our various social media platforms on YouTube. You can listen to it live on www.salammedia.com, and we'll also be having post analysis, the post reaction that will follow after that budget speech. So stay tuned for further analysis as we break down some of the key announcements from today's budget that will be presented by Minister of Finance Enoch Godongwana. Now we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, News and Views continues after this.
Humanity sets the agenda.